World War III starts tomorrow. China's first 72 hours there is no missile. There is a fishing boat that drifts too close to a disputed reef at dawn, and a Coast Guard cutter that has patrolled these waters for years. Without incident suddenly does something it has never done before. It does not warn, it rams. The footage reaches the outside world in 9 minutes, badly lit, shaking, and by the time anyone senior enough to matter has watched it twice, the story has already outrun the facts. This is how the 21st century ends a piece. Not with a declaration, but with a video clip nobody can verify, and everybody believes that this is not history. It has not happened, but the machinery that would make it happen already exists, oiled and waiting, in rooms on 3 continents. This is what the first 72 hours would look like if it did. Hour 1. The silence before the Estate Muenti in Beijing. Nothing is announced. That is the first sign that something has changed. For 6 hours, state media runs the ordinary schedule: cooking segments, a documentary about high-speed rail, a rerun of a costume drama while behind sealed doors in the Ministry of National Defense. A decision is being made about how large to let this become. Silence, in a system built on constant narrative control, is its own kind of announcement. Foreign desks in Tokyo, Manila, and Washington notice it before their own governments do. An absence of statement is read correctly as the sound of a decision not yet finished. When the statement finally comes, it is 4 sentences long. It does not use the word war. It uses the phrase gray zone, provocation, and promises resolute countermeasures proportional to the threat. Analysts who have spent careers parsing this kind of language recognize immediately that proportional is doing a great deal of quiet, ominous work. Hour 6. The quarantine, not the invasion. What arrives first is not an invasion fleet. It is worse, in its way, because it is legal. Beijing announces a customs inspection zone encircling the island, not a blockade. Officially, because a blockade is an act of war, and this, on paper, is merely enforcement of sovereign shipping law. Every vessel entering or leaving the islands ports must now submit to inspection by Coast Guard and maritime militia. Vessels operating under a flag that is technically civilian and functionally military. Insurance underwriters in London reprice shipping risk within the hour. Container lines quietly reroute vessels already at sea, eating losses in the tens of millions rather than testing the new rules. Within a day, the island that manufactures the chips inside nearly every phone, car, and data center on Earth finds its ports operating at a fraction of normal throughput, not because anyone fired a shot, but because everyone with a ship worth insuring decided the risk was no longer worth it. This is the innovation the planners always feared most. A war that never has to be declared, because it never technically starts. It simply tightens, like a hand closing slowly enough that no single moment can be pointed to as the crime. Hour 12. The island. Waiting. On the island itself, the mood is not panic. It is a strange, brittle calm, the calm of people who have rehearsed this exact scenario in their heads for 30 years and are now watching it happen with a kind of exhausted recognition. Reservist call-up texts arrive on phones, mid-shift, mid-meal, Supermarkets do not empty in a rush. They're empty in an orderly, methodical way. Families buying exactly what emergency broadcasts have told them to buy for a decade. No more, no less. As though the drill and the reality have finally become indistinguishable. Night markets stay open. Neon signs stay lit. This, too, is deliberate, a quiet civic performance of normalcy. Because the alternative is to hand the adversary a photograph of a frightened city, and no one here is willing to give away that photograph for free. Overseas, the diaspora reacts faster than the diplomats. Group chats spanning 6 time zones fill with instructions, addresses, spare rooms offered to relatives who might need to leave quickly. A generation raised abroad, once accused of being disconnected from the island, proves in these hours to be anything but. Hour 24. Washington discovers its own DAP and DINCE in Washington. The emergency is not military at first. It is industrial. A fabrication plant 3 time zones away produces the components inside fighter jets, medical devices, and the servers running half the internet's invisible infrastructure. And for decades this dependency was treated as a manageable inconvenience rather than a live vulnerability. Now it is neither manageable nor an inconvenience. Cabinet officials who have spent years discussing de-risking in slow, unhurried tones discover exactly how far from finished that project actually was. Allies fracture along old, familiar lines. Some commit instantly, citing treaty obligations rehearsed for exactly this contingency. Others hedge, citing energy contracts, citing exposure, citing a public exhausted by a decade of overlapping crises and unwilling to absorb one more. In Brussels, a joint statement takes 11 hours to draft because 2 member states cannot agree on a single adjective describing the Coast Guard's actions. The war has not started, and already language itself has become a battlefield. Hour 36. The economy feels it before the army's DO markets. Do not wait for artillery. A currency slides. A benchmark index drops in a single session by a margin that used to take a full year. Energy traders, watching tanker insurance rates spike. begin rerouting cargoes around a strait that has never before required rerouting. In interior cities far from any coastline, none of this looks like war. It looks like a grocery bill that is suddenly, inexplicably, 40% higher than it was a week ago, and a factory manager explaining to workers that the export orders that fed their town for a generation have simply, quietly, stopped arriving. This is the part the old war films never captured well. How much of a modern conflict is fought first in spreadsheets, in shipping manifests, in the space between an insurance quote and a decision not to sail. Hour 48, the room where restraint is DIBAT inside the compound walls of Zhongnanhai. The debate is not whether to escalate further, it is how to escalate without triggering the one response that cannot be walked back. Older officials, veterans of a system that has survived by never fully committing to any irreversible act, argue for patience. Let the quarantine do its slow work. Let economic pressure accomplish what force might not. Younger officials, shaped by a decade of nationalist rhetoric they did not invent but now must satisfy, argue that hesitation reads as weakness to a domestic audience primed for resolve. No one in that room says the word nuclear. Everyone in that room has, at some point in the last year, read a briefing that mentions it. The distance between those two facts is where the actual danger of these 72 hours lies, not in any single decision, but in the gap between what officials will say aloud and what they have already been forced to consider in private. Hour 72, the threshold that holds. For UNOW by the third day, nothing has been fired. The quarantine tightens further. A cyber intrusion briefly darkens a power grid on the island's northern coast, restored within 6 hours, its origin publicly unconfirmed and privately unmistakable. A destroyer from a third nation, transiting the strait under freedom of navigation protocol. It's shadowed for 11 hours by vessels that never once radio a warning, communicating instead through proximity alone. And yet the guns stay silent. The old, grim architecture of mutual deterrence, battered, reduced, no longer as trusted as it once was, still holds, for now, by the thinnest of margins. None of this has happened. Not the rammed fishing boat, not the quarantine, not the group chats filling with spare addresses. It remains, as of this telling, a possibility rather than a record. History has stood at thresholds like this before and, more often than not, stepped back not because the danger was ever imagined away, but because enough people in enough rooms chose the slower, harder path over the fast and irreversible one. The question this leaves behind is not whether the reef, or one like it, will one day be tested. It is whether the world watching it happen will recognize the moment for what it is before the video clip finishes uploading or only afterward, the way it so often does. Once the 72 hours are already history and there is nothing left to do but reckon with what was allowed to happen in the space between the first silence and the first shot.